Sława everyone, Sława Bogom, and welcome in the second episode of the third season of Searching for the Slavic Soul. For these who did not listen to the previous episode, just a reminder that in the season 3 of this podcast I am summarizing 2 volumes of Kultura Duchowa, which is the spiritual culture of the Slavs, obviously, which is a monumental work by Kazimierz Moszyński, who was a Polish ethnographer. And also, before I get to summarizing the book, I would also like to note that to make it easier, everything I will say in the rest of this podcast is what Moszyński wrote in Kultura Duchowa. I don't make stuff up. And if I will want to add something that's not in the book, I will make it very clear that it's me adding it and not Moszyński who wrote it. And when I say that Slavs this or Slavs that, by Slavs I mean the people who lived in the pre-industrial rural areas of the Slavdom where Moszyński conducted his research at the beginning of the 20th century. So, with all the notifications out of the way, let's get on into the topic. Today I will summarize pages 41 to 97 of the volume 1, the tome 1 of Kultura Duchowa. On these pages, Moszyński discusses the Slavic knowledge of the nature, like nature as in the world of nature, so the rivers, forests, lakes and such. Another topic that Moszyński discusses on these pages is how he calls it the phenomenons of psychic life. So the senses as hearing or seeing, as well as concepts related to the emotional and mental functioning, so basically to feeling and thinking. So let's start with nature and let's start with water. It does not seem that Slavs knew or really were interested in knowing what makes rivers, lakes or seas. Seas as the large body of water, so like Baltic Sea, for example. It seems they were just accepting the fact that these structures exist, and they did not try to understand it, understand as the modern science tries to understand what makes the rivers or lakes or, seas. What is the thing on which Moszyński does not comment, however, it is obvious when reading the chapters as summarized today, is that Slavs did not see the natural world, so the world of nature, as a mechanism or a system of devices or something like that, but they perceived the natural world as a living organism. So, for example, while describing what Slavs living by the White Sea, and White Sea is an inlet of the Barents Sea, so we are talking the northwest coast of Russia. So Moszyński reports that when talking about the tides of the White Sea, the Slavs they describe it like, they said that when the tide is rising, they would say that the sea comes alive or wakes up. And when the tide is at its maximal height, they would say that the water is fulfilled. And when the tide starts falling, I'm not sure if it's because of the local geography or it's normal for all the tides, and Moszyński doesn't clarify it, but when the tide is falling, there is a period of time when the water stops moving, and the Slavs will say that when the water stops moving, the water of the tide, then it becomes lost in thoughts. Quite similar vocabulary Moszyński reports from Slavs living by the rivers, which back then the rivers, they were mostly unregulated, and hence the levels of water in these rivers were changing, although obviously not in the same way, on the same scale as the level of the water in seas. Because I am a total vocabulary nerd, I could not get enough of the fragments of Kultura Duchowa, where there was discussion about the names of woodlands and wetlands. I will not bore you with details, but I'm just going to mention here that Slavs, due to living mostly in or near forests and wetlands, they had absolutely mind-blowing wealth of names for various types of forests and muddy areas. Many of the names that Moszyński lists, they were not known to me, so I assume that this vocabulary sadly is being lost as we speak. But in Slavic languages, they were, and hopefully still are to some degree, separate and distinctive names for forest that is small, that is large, that is young, old, coniferous, deciduous, mixed, and separate names for forest that grows on a lowland or on a highland or on the top of a mountain. There were or are still separate and distinctive names for a small swamp in the forest or a large swamp in the forest, for swamps by the river where there's a lot of common reed growing. Separate name for wetland that is more like a meadow or a wetland where there is a lot of moss, or for a swamp that is just a swamp with not much plants. By the way, such swamp with no plants is called hawo or gawo, which means naked mud. As to the weather, Slavs definitely had more interest in what causes various weather events than in, let's say, where the rivers come from. But the majority of explanations for the weather events were supernatural. So the explanations were supernatural. So Moszyński just signals it and mentions he will be discussing it further in the book. So we will get to it too in the future episodes. But as far as not supernatural explanations, it is pretty much obvious that from a point of view of a Slav, winds or clouds are also living things, as they can come out of a cave, they can hide in a cave, they can run around, and they can even have arguments with other winds, which is how, according to Slavs, all sorts of whirlwinds develop. Moszyński briefly mentions that Slavs also had a very rich vocabulary for different types of winds, but he does not list a single name of the wind, which for me is just simply and plain heartbreaking and not fair. And I hereby protest the injustice. It is just not right. He should have listed all the names of the winds, shouldn't he? But instead of listing the names of the winds, Moszyński moves to the clouds in Slavic tradition. And he concludes that there are two basic ways in which Slavs saw clouds. One way was to see them as a smoke, as it is apparently a common way of cloud perception by the pre-industrial humans. The other way in which Slavs thought about clouds was that the clouds were made of a special porous jelly-like substance filled with water or snow or ice. And when the substance cannot hold the water or snow or ice anymore, it rips or breaks, and all the content of the cloud falls out of it, causing rain, snow, or hail to fall on the ground. This view is reflected in a Polish idiom which goes oberwanie chmury, which literally means the tearing off or ripping off a cloud, and it is used to describe a very heavy rain. From what I understand, a similar idiom is present in Czech language, where they talk about breaking of clouds. If you're interested, and that is me saying it, not Moszyński, a pretty much pan-Slavic and it actually seems pan-European idiom for heavy rain is that it runs or it flows like from a bucket. From what I understand, such an idiom is present in most, if not all, Slavic languages, and I think in German, Italian, and French too. I read that raining buckets is an idiom in English, but I have never heard it in my over 20 years of living in UK. I've only heard that it's raining cats and dogs or that it's pissing down like hell. But we are getting off topic, so I'm just going to shut up now and get back to Moszyński. So the majority view among the Slavs was that the clouds are made of jelly-like substance. Some peasants with whom Moszyński spoke told him that they actually found pieces of clouds that fell from the sky, and some of these peasants even tried it as in tasted the clouds, the pieces of fallen clouds. Moszyński never saw such fallen cloud, but he hypothesizes that the peasants could have been finding pieces of something that is called in Polish trzęsidło and in English is called star jelly or witch's butter, and its official name of this thing is Nostoc sp. And nostoc is a type of bacteria that's common in Europe. It's like cyanobacteria. And because this star jelly thing looks so cool, and because the whole story is, in my humble opinion, super cool as well, this is why the picture of witch's butter is the artwork for today's episode. So this thing on the picture for this episode is according to Slavs, the fallen cloud, a piece of fallen cloud. And as to how the clouds move on the sky, according to Slavs, there does not seem to be a consensus. Some believe that the clouds just walk all by themselves. Some think that they are being pulled or pushed around by people with supernatural powers or by various supernatural beings, of which we'll be talking in the future episodes. Another thing that Slavs could not agree on was, where does dew come from? Some thought it fell from the sky, and some thought it was the earth sweating, or that dew just walks out of the ground. Also, it was not uncommon belief, especially in Russia, that the dew is actually the thing that makes cows give milk or makes bees make honey. Moszyński writes a lot about the weather, and there is even a special chapter dedicated to predicting of the weather. But I don't think that's that important for followers of Slavic native faith. Maybe other than a bit of a factoid, I guess, that in Croatia, the weather could be told with a flower called vremenokaz, which literally means one that tells the weather. This flower in English is called Carline thistle, and it was kept indoors, and the weather was predicted based on whether the petals of this flower were open or closed. Sadly, Moszyński's source for this information did not clarify what weather the closed petals predicted and what weather it predicted when the petals were open. And maybe one more thing I'll mention, because Moszyński mentions that the ways in which Slavs predicted weather they were actually tested by meteorologists, and it turned out that predictions of local people, that these predictions were surprisingly accurate, but the common sayings or the proverbs were actually not accurate. So Moszyński explains it by the phenomenon of catchy phrases. So as you most probably know, a lot of these folk weather-related saying, like in English, if November ice will bear a duck, all the rest is mud and muck. So these weather-related sayings, they rhyme and they kind of are catchy, so people just repeat it. And because these sayings, they predict the weather accurately in around 50% of the cases, which is basically as accurate as a coin toss, then people will remember when the proverb predicted accurately and will either forget or explain away where it doesn't predict accurately. But the local lore held by individuals in a particular area where the weather actually is these individuals' do or die. These individuals don't just repeat stupid rhymes, but they pay close attention to the weather, to the direction of the wind, to the clouds, to the behavior of animals and such. And basing on all of these observations, they are able to make a decent prediction. Obviously, it's never going to be 100% accurate because with weather it never is, but it's going to have a better accuracy than a coin toss. Moszyński talks quite a lot about Slavs' in-depth understanding of animals' behavior and anatomy, both internal and external, but I am not going to elaborate on that since it should be obvious to anyone that people who hunt for living, keep animals for living, slaughter said animals and then process all the meat themselves, they ought to know a lot about the behavior and anatomy of the animals these people hunt, keep, slaughter, and cut. As far as behavior goes, the few things of which Slavs did not have a lot of understanding was the migrations of the birds, which is obvious since pre-industrial Slavs, they did not have radio or GPS trackers. So, for example, Slavs thought that swifts and swallows, that these little birds, they spend the winter in the frozen lakes. Moszyński suspects the reason for that was that during migrations, some small birds, such as swifts, that they can get tired or blown away by the winds and land or fall into lakes where the bodies were later found by the Slavs. And another thing that the Slavs did not figure out were the life cycles of some animals, mostly insects. So the Slavs, they mostly did not know where, for example, butterflies come from. I have to admit that the stories that they told Moszyński about butterflies, they're super creative and could be a topic for potentially fascinating monograph. According to the stories Moszyński heard, butterflies are born like humans, or they can come out of the ground, or they are born out of dew, or from spider webs, or they are born by various beetles. And some Slavs even thought that butterflies just fall out of the sky. Maybe one more thing I mention, which is quite cool in and of itself, because Slavs believed that mice can transform into bats. So according to Slavs, bats are not like coming from bats, but they come from mice that grow wings. And the reason why that's cool, in my opinion, because Moszyński does not elaborate on it, is that, as you know, if you read translation on Witia Substack, then you should know that Slavs also believed that ancestors can take on a form of mice. Hence, for example, the legend of Popiel, who was eaten alive. He was a Polish prince, and he was eaten alive by mice in Kruszwica. I am just going to link up to this legend as not to veer too much off the topic. And here I'm just going to mention that the mice, which represented ancestors, they ate Popiel after he broke the Slavic laws of hospitality and caring for the dead. So anyway, mice represent ancestors, and bats, as I bet you all know, are one of the forms which vampires can take. And as you know, hopefully, vampires are Slavic demons which raise if a person with vampiric features does not receive proper funeral rites. So from this point of view, it follows that mice can transform into bats, since ancestors without proper funeral rites can transform into vampires. And this is why it is so important for any follower of Slavic native faith to understand comprehensively Slavic point of view and Slavic cultural background, because Slavic tradition has very consistent internal logic, which you simply cannot comprehend if you don't know and don't understand the cultural context of Slavic tradition. But again, this is a comment from me, and now back to Moszyński. Now I want to move to psychological phenomenons, of which Moszyński writes extensively. In the category of psychological phenomenons, Moszyński includes subjective perception of input from our senses, such as taste, smell, hearing, or vision, which kind of makes sense because although the reception of stimuli from the outside world is a physiological phenomenon, which results from stimulation of some various receptors, the way we interpret the stimulation of these receptors is a subject of interpretation by our cognition, which makes it a psychological phenomenon. Moszyński explains, may I say, in a really smart way, which just shows what a great thinker and writer Moszyński is. So he explains it using the perception of salty and sweet taste. I don't know if you know, I did not know that prior to reading Moszyński, that in small concentration, salty taste can be perceived as sweet, which is a very typical quirk of taste receptors in humans and, as far as I understand, in many other mammals. And it actually shows, this phenomenon shows in Slavic languages, because the Pan-Slavic word for sweet, which is sołdiki, and for salty, which is solny, they both come from the same root, from pra-Indo-European sold, which means salt. Then we have goriki, which is Pan-Slavic for bitter, and it comes from the same root as Polish word gorzeć, which means to burn. Kysli, Pan-Slavic word for sour, has the same root as, say, Polish word kisić, which means to preserve, but means of lactic acid fermentation, which you, as you might or might not know, is a very much Slavic way of preserving food. In Slavic cuisine, there's a lot of sour things, like sour cabbage, which is sauerkraut, sour cucumbers, beetroot, carrots, cauliflowers, green beans, peppers, mushrooms. Slavs also sour whole raw milk, which is called in Polish kwaśne mleko, and it's absolutely delicious. And of course, you can sour bread, which is how you get kwas, which is a type of low alcohol beverage, very popular in Slavic countries. So, in Kultura Duchowa, Moszyński gets through all the senses. He gets through sounds and smell and vision. The part about hearing is super interesting if you are into linguistics because of all the onomatopoeias that Moszyński lists as the etymology of many Slavic words. However, the part about vision is even more interesting because Moszyński points out that pretty much pan-Slavic word for knowing, like Polish wiedzieć or Russian wiedzieć, that these words have the same root, which is Proto-Slavic vedeti, which means to know by having seen, which basically means that our ancestors thought that seeing is knowing, or knowing is seeing. That would explain, and that's my comment, since Moszyński does not mention it, why there are no invisible demonic creatures in Slavic mythology. There are some creatures that can make themselves invisible temporarily, but all creatures in Slavic demonology have bodies, and at least in certain circumstances or by certain people, they can be seen. From interesting bits, while talking about vision, Moszyński does mention that the root of pan-Slavic names of shades of blue and grey is the word sin, which actually originally meant bright, as in bright light or bright white color, which is just another way of showing how subjective the perception of our senses is. That some people see blue, some people see white, and some people see grey, and we can all see it in etymology of Slavic languages. But where I am going with it, following Moszyński reasoning, where I'm going with it is that Slavic language is deeply rooted in the bodies of the Slavs. The words that describe perceiving the reality can be traced back to how we actually perceive reality with our senses, including the common root of the words describing the sweet and salty taste. Because at low levels of saltiness, what we perceive is actually, it tastes sweet. This strong bond between the Slavic language and the way the reality is perceived with our senses is even more obvious in the way the Slavs talked about emotions. So, discussing Slavic vocabulary about emotions, Moszyński makes two things clear. One is that a lot of Slavic words describing emotions are basically pan-Slavic and have not changed much since the times the pre-Slavic language was spoken. And the other thing is that pretty much all Slavic vocabulary related to emotions describes literally how emotions feel within the body. So we have the verb sierdzić się or srdzić się, which means to be very angry, and it originates from srdce, which literally means this which is inside, and it is also a pan-Slavic name for the heart. And also the się or się in the verb sierdzić się or srdzić się indicates that the verbs are reflexive, so the action expressed by the verb is directed to the same person or thing that performs the action. So basically, in Slavic understanding, if you are very angry, you are doing something to yourself with your insides or with your heart. Then you have the pan-Slavic gniew, which means severe anger, like wrath or fury. The noun gniew has the same origin as the Polish verb gnić, which means to rot, and it is suspected that originally it meant poison, but not like arsenic or hemlock, but like the poison in food poisoning, so the toxins that are produced when something is rotting. So basically, in Slavic understanding, severe anger is like rot or poison. If you cultivate such poison, as expressed in the verb gniewać się, which let me remind you, has this się in it, so it's a reflexive verb. So if you cultivate gniew, which means that you cultivate severe anger, according to Slavs, you are poisoning yourself. Another verb for anger is żołądkować się, which originates from also Pan-Slavic word żełotki, which is the stomach. Again, very easy to spot the meaning. To be angry is to do something to yourself with your stomach. And then there is, again, Pan-Slavic zawisti, which means envy. It is a compound noun made up from a prefix za and the verb videti. Videti means to see, and the suffix za means in various senses behind, beyond, for, or after. So in Slavic languages, envy means to literally look at something for too long and look at it after it passed you and left you behind, which is really the definition of envy. It is the feeling that you get when you see something that's not yours or is out of your reach and you cannot have it. The noun zawisti is the root of many other words like Polish zawistny or Russian zawisliwy, which means envious but also spiteful and generally full of hate. And it is all from looking too long at something that's beyond your reach. We get pretty much the same picture when we look at vocabulary describing nice things like Polish przyjemny or Russian приятный, which both mean nice or pleasant, and both come from the same Proto-Slavic root eunti, which means to grasp, which are prefix przy or pri, both meaning at or close to. So something that is nice or pleasant is something that you want to grasp, to bring close and keep near, because it's nice or pleasant. And another one, but kind of going the other way around, is the name of rainbow in Slavic languages. In Russian, for example, rainbow is called raduga, which comes from Proto-Slavic rad, which means joy. From the same root, rad or radość, Polish word for joy, is derived. In Ukrainian, rainbow is called weselka, which comes from Proto-Slavic wesel, which means joyful. In pretty much all Slavic languages, Proto-Slavic wesel is the root for adjective wesoły, which means joyful, and the noun wesele, which means wedding. So in Slavic languages, with exception of Polish and I think Sorbian, a rainbow is the cause of joy or of being merry. As a factoid, I will add from me, not from Moszyński, that Polish and Sorbian languages name rainbow after Proto-Slavic tocha, which means a thundercloud. Because, you know, we Poles are such an insightful and retrospective nation that even in the rainbows we see, in retrospection, the thunderclouds that preceded. But that's my comment, and I'm getting back to Moszyński momentarily. I know you are most probably fed up with all this etymology, but I really, really have to mention one more thing. Namely, the Slavic concept of cognition and memory, which will require me to continue digging in etymology. But there is a point in it, so just bear with me. If you look at Slavic vocabulary related to cognition and memory, there are two core Pan-Slavic roots. The first one is Proto-Slavic word mailto, which means a thought, and the second one is which means mind. To the latter word, the so mind, the Proto-Slavs added prefix orz, which indicates division or separation, to have a Proto-Slavic orzum, which means reason or intellect. By the way, I'm going to add here that Moszyński doesn't mention it, but the Proto-Slavic orzum went through the process of Common Slavic liquid metathesis, which is a process of swapping sounds around, which resulted in the Pan-Slavic rozum, which still means reason or intellect. As far as the Proto-Slavic mount, so the thought, Proto-Slavs added prefix pa to it, which indicates that something is after or later, and that resulted in the Proto-Slavic pamount, which means memory. So, according to our ancestors, to remember is to have a thought after or a thought later, and to reason is to use your mind to divide or separate. Moszyński shows it beautifully by analyzing his conversations with pre-industrial Slavs, who divided the mental processes of humans into two separate categories. The first category, related to pamięć, so the memory, is a concept of oneself, the state of being aware that one exists. The second category, related to orzum, so to reason, is the ability to comprehend, to think, or to reason. The Slavs understood that a human can have both the pamięć and the orzum, or can have only one of them, or can have none. Children and stupid people don't have the based ability, they don't have the reason, are not able to think properly. People who are unconscious or overtaken by severe affect, like gniew, so anger, they don't have the mount-based ability, so they don't have the thoughts, the awareness that they exist. Or they don't have the pamięć-based ability, so the ability to retain the thoughts for long enough to remember it, which, if you look at it from the third-person perspective, is pretty much the same thing. It's pretty much the same thing because it doesn't matter if you don't have thoughts or you don't remember, then you have thoughts, the outcome is the same. According to Slavs, the based ability is something that can be acquired, which is how children acquire reason as they grow up. But the mount or pamount-based ability is something that one can only lose as one gets older, for example, or regain as one manages to overcome, for example, severe anger. But one cannot just learn or acquire pamięć. One either has it or not. What more, there is a relation between the or the orzum, so the mind or intellect, and the mount or pamięć, so the thoughts and remembering them. If one takes too much in one's pamięć, so the concept of oneself, then the orzum, so the reason, will get confused, which suggests that the pamięć, the memory-based awareness of one's existence, is primary, and the orzum, the ability to reason, is secondary, which is confirmed in how Slavs saw the cognitive abilities of animals who, according to Slavs, had the pamięć but did not have the Slavs also had the distinction, not known in English, between the knowing related to pamięć, to remembering, and the knowing related to so the reasoning. The knowing related to pamięć is of two kinds. One is the mentioned earlier knowing related to seeing, like in Polish widzieć, and the second is knowing related to recognizing, which originates from Proto-Slavic znać, which is the root of Pan-Slavic znak, which means a sign or symbol. In Polish, the knowing related to recognizing is znać, in Russian is znać, and as far as I know, it is pretty much the same or very similar in other Slavic languages. But both seeing and recognizing types of knowing, the wiedzieć and the znać, require pamięć, so the memory, to exist. The related knowing has one kind, it doesn't have any subtypes and requires application of reason. It is knowing by understanding, by knowing how. And it's also a pan-Slavic concept reflected in, as far as I know, all or nearly all Slavic languages. Moszyński talks a lot about the Slavic concepts of being crazy, stupid, or mistaken, which seem to be more of a spectrum of one phenomenon than three distinctive states. So in the Slavic way of thinking about thinking, the difference between being mistaken, being stupid, or being crazy is a matter of degree and a matter of how long this, let's call it, condition lasts. To explain it very quickly, it's all about the contact with reality that one has. If one is only, say, seeing something that's not there or not recognizing it properly, this person might just be mistaken. If he or she is seeing something that's not there for only a short period of time. But if one sees things that are not there all the time, or is not recognizing things properly all the time, that would indicate being crazy or stupid, with the distinction between crazy and stupid being very, very vague and undefined. So for the Slavs, mistaken, crazy, and stupid are not three separate categories, which is also reflected in Slavic languages, as well as in the explanations that Slavs gave to Moszyński when he interviewed them. But I'm not going to be talking about it more because I am already talking far too long. So that is it with regards to the summary of pages 41 to 97 of Kultura Duchowa by Moszyński. As in previous episode, before I end, I'd like to highlight some points that I think are important, and I fear I might have not stressed them enough in today's summary. While reading Moszyński, it is absolutely clear that the mental, the psychological functioning in the Slavic way is deeply embodied, is rooted in experience, and is empathy-driven sharing of reality. When talking about sensations, Slavs use vocabulary that directly relates to the sensations with and within the body, and this vocabulary has been understood and shared as a common language through time, space, and generations. I only brought up a few examples in this episode, but Moszyński writes nearly 30 pages about embodied etymology of Slavic emotions and senses and cognition and memory, making it crystal clear that the Slavic way of life is to live in your body, with your body, and by your body. For the Slavs, there is no Cartesian mind-body separation. There is no mind that only needs body for the purpose of locomotion as the ancient Greeks saw it. The Slavs are present, they are embodied. They feel even if it poisons them with rot from the inside. They are aware that emotion can take away the reason, the but they feel their emotions anyway, because this is how you get through life as a human being, not a drugged up zombie, of which I talked extensively in the third episode of the second season of Searching for the Slavic Soul, so I will not be talking about it now. And the second conclusion of reading Moszyński is, as I already mentioned it, but will repeat it anyway, Slavs see the world as an organism, not as a machine. If you want to follow the path of our Slavic ancestors, you simply have to stop looking at the world as at a collection of parts and elements that can be used or abused. The water is not a commodity. It is a living being that can be awakened, can get lost in thoughts or experience fulfillment. The clouds are not a part of a machine that can be seeded or exploited. It is a living thing that can walk, break, fall down, and even be tasted. The winds can get angry, scared, or have an argument. They are not just a resource to be utilized. And we, humans, are not some sort of walking minds that can be swapped around. As every single thing in the world of the Slavs, we are alive and organic. We see, we feel, taste, we remember, we understand, and we are able, with enough presence in the world, we are able to befriend and understand the world around us to such extent that we can predict and anticipate the moods and interpersonal drama of the winds, the clouds, and even the lost in thoughts seas. And yet again, I talked today longer than I planned, but I'm not even sorry, because I do think that Moszyński is important to know for every single aspiring Rodnover out there. In the next episode, in one moon, I will be talking about Slavic mathematics, and hopefully I get to medicine too. And for now, thank you for listening, and hear you next time. Sława!